My name is Shaylyn McNally, and my research project is on the psychology behind forming and breaking habits. Before I start talking about habit formation, I just wanted to create a general understanding of the science and research behind it. So I am going to start with an introduction of what behavioral psychology actually is. It is a specific type of psychology that was established in 1913 by John B. Watson, aka the father of behaviorism, and it was established on a theory that all behaviors are learned through conditioning and environmental effects. The conditioning of a habit occurs through interactions that we have with others and the environment that becomes stimuli for certain behaviors. With the correct conditioning, you can be taught to perform a certain task that is evoked by that stimuli. The only error with this theory is that it does not account for moods, thoughts, feelings, or biological influences that a person may have. When learning a new behavior, there are two different types of conditioning that you can go through: classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is a type of behavior training where different types of stimuli are paired with different responses. At some point, you will introduce a neutral stimuli to this behavior, and soon you will associate that neutral stimuli with that behavior instead of the actual behavior, but it will still trigger the exact same response. This response is referred to as the conditioned stimuli and conditioned response. You can see an example of classical conditioning off to the right of your screen. This scenario is that someone is getting bullied, and the response to them getting bullied is being fearful around that person. This is the unconditioned stimulus and response because this happens naturally and there is no outside force acting upon this behavior. Then the bullying starts happening in school. This acts as the neutral stimuli because the person has no response to school. Now, because the bullying is happening at school, the person is now conditioned to be fearful at school because that is where the bullying is taking place. The second type of conditioning is operant conditioning, and this is based off of reinforcements and punishments. There is an association between the behavior that is made and the outcome of that behavior. If the behavior has a desirable outcome, you are more likely to want to repeat that behavior. But if the behavior has an undesirable outcome, you are less likely to want to repeat that behavior in the future. There is an example of operant conditioning on the right of your screen. A reinforcement increases a desirable behavior and a punishment decreases an undesirable behavior. Positive applies to the stimulus and negative takes the stimulus away. A lot of times when people hear the words positive and negative, they associate them with being good and bad. But in psychology, that is not the case. These words are applying that you are adding and taking things away from a scenario. An example of positive reinforcement is when you study really hard and get a good grade on a test. The positive result will encourage the behavior to happen again. An example of negative reinforcement would be that you behave well during class, and so your teacher takes away all of your homework for the night. The positive result takes away an annoying consequence. An example of positive punishment is when you cheat on a test and you get an F. An undesirable result will make you not want to exhibit that behavior. And lastly, an example of a negative punishment is when you do not pay attention during class, and so the teacher takes your phone away. This is an undesirable behavior resulting in an undesirable consequence. Now that we have a general understanding of what behavioral psychology is and how it applies to us, we can apply this knowledge to show how we form habits. A habit is a routine of behavior that is repeated regularly and tends to occur subconsciously. Most everyday things that we do become habits without us even realizing because they require little thought and energy while we are doing them. This allows us to do them while we are completing another task. And because of this, we develop multiple different habits every day without even realizing. For example, when you drive to school every day and you develop a habit of where you turn at and what stop sign you know that you have to look out for because it is hidden behind a tree. Be careful, though, to not confuse a habit with a routine. A routine is more of a repeated behavior that is not an ingrained response in you. We build habits based on learning and repetition when trying to pursue simple tasks or goals. This is often referred to as the habit loop as you keep on developing more and more habits. You learn to associate different cues or stimuli with specific responses that we can think about unconsciously. Over time, if you keep on repeating that behavior in the same way, and you learn that there are no negative consequences to this action, you develop a trigger, and that causes you to causes you to exhibit the habit when the cue or stimuli is presented. So when you are developing a habit, you are using both classical and operant conditioning to help you. You are using classical conditioning as the cues that come from the unconditioned stimulus to create a new conditioned response when the cue is presented. And you are using operant conditioning and positive reinforcement to allow yourself to repeat the behavior over and over again without any major consequences. The only exception to this would be if you were to develop an unhealthy habit, such as drugs, alcohol, or smoking. Some common habits that people develop are nail biting, playing with your hair, avoiding eye contact with others, cracking your joints, and skipping breakfast, and procrastination. Most of these habits have very common triggers such as anxiety, and some of them we repeat because there has been no negative consequences to our action yet. In order to form good habits, you want to make sure that you consciously follow these 4 steps. The first step is to identify which habits are good habits and which ones are bad. Good habits will keep you on track to reach your goals, and bad habits will get in the way of you achieving your goals. The next step is to strengthen your willpower. You will use your willpower to push through and overcome obstacles when things get hard and you face challenges. The third step is surrounding yourself with positivity. You don't want to try to be developing a healthy habit around someone who is constantly telling you that your dreams won't happen. This positivity will naturally strengthen your mind, which allows you to put in more effort towards creating good habits. Lastly, you want to develop a routine of your habit to make it happen more regularly. The cue and reward part of a habit you really have no control over, because your brain decides the triggers It will take a while to develop a routine and get the hang of it, but soon enough you will notice that you almost won't be able to complete something without this habit. So now that you know how habits form and how to make good habits, you need to know how to break the bad habits that we all unfortunately form. In order to break bad habits, you need to break the habit loop that you use when making a habit. The first step to breaking habits is to take small steps. These habits took a while to form, and so they aren't just going to break overnight. You have to have patience and work in small steps to make sure that you are successful in breaking a habit. Step 2 is knowing your cues and triggers for certain habits. We know that habits strengthen once they are reinforced, and knowing what the different triggers are for these habits will help you understand when you are exhibiting a habit. Step 3 is to make sure that you are only focusing on one habit at a time. This may seem like common sense, but we often have so many habits that we want to break that we try to break them all at the same time. You can form multiple habits at one time, but you cannot break them in that same way. And lastly, step 4 is using replacements. You can remove a bad habit and replace it with a good habit to help you. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope that you learned something about forming and breaking bad habits.